Welcome again to Biblical Insights with Bob. Tonight I want to talk about Amazing Grace. Now, we know that song. We've sung it since we were kids, still sing it. But you know what? Grace is amazing. I want to start out with a story about World War II. In 1944, a man by the name of Bert Frison was an infantryman on the front lines in Europe. Now, the American forces had moved ahead in spite of shelling and small arms fire. His patrol had reached the edge of a wooded area with an open field in between the woods and them. Unknown to the American forces, there was a battery of Germans waiting in that woods on the other side of the field, about 200 yards. Bert was one of two scouts that went first ahead of the troops. So two of them moved into this clearing. Once he was about halfway across the field, the remainder of his troops, his battalion, followed him. Suddenly, the Germans opened fire, and the American battalion retreated as the enemy fire ripped through both of Bert's legs. So he fell and laid helplessly in a small stream as shots volleyed overhead. Now, Bert laid there knowing that he was about to die. To make matters worse, as he looked out above the bank of the stream, he saw a single German crawling toward him across that. So he knew that German was going to kill him. He closed his eyes and waited for everything to happen. But he looked up, and there he was, the German. Without any word, without any verbal exchange, that German reached down, lifted Bert into his arms, and proceeded to carry him across the field back to the safety of his own battalion. Having reached that point, he laid him down in the company of his troops, and without speaking a word, this German soldier turned around, walked back across the field to his own. Both sides were absolutely silent. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. One man risks everything for the enemy. Now, folks, that's grace. That's a good definition of grace. But it's also a picture of what Jesus Christ did for us. He didn't risk his life. He gave his life while we were yet sinners, when we were the enemy. So why do we call it grace amazing? Because it works against common sense. Who would have thought that a German soldier would do what the story tells us he did? And common sense, hard-nosed common sense, tells us that we've been too bad, we're too wrong to meet the standards of a holy God. I could never stand in the presence of a holy God. But God's grace, his pardoning grace, tells us that when we believe in him, everything's right in spite of so much in me that's wrong. Realistic common sense tells you that you're too weak, too harassed, too human to change for the better. Grace gives you power to send your own way to being a better person. Isn't grace amazing? Look at the definition of grace. In many Bibles, it's just says grace is unmerited favor. Unmerited. We don't deserve it. Now, recently I read about 3 characteristics of God, and they've stuck with me, and I think it's a good description of the character of God. The first element is justice. God is holy. God is just. God is righteous. Folks, none of us can measure up to that holiness and that righteousness. But the second thing is God is a merciful God. Mercy means not punishing us when we deserve to be punished. Grace is the third. Justice, mercy, and grace. Grace is unmerited favor. Undeserved. It goes beyond mercy because mercy doesn't give us what we do deserve. But grace gives us what we do not deserve. I like that. We have to remember, God is a just God. He demands righteousness. But he's a merciful God. He sent his Son. Romans 5:8, Paul says, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were yet sinners, Christ died. Now that's mercy. That's grace. And so our salvation, our right standing in his presence, our righteousness, if you will, is an element of grace, is a result of God's grace. Jesus brought this in through his death, resurrection, and ascension. Look with me at 2 scriptures. First of all, John 3:16. You know it, you can say it with me. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, so that whosoever believes on him should not perish, but have eternal life. Should not perish. We deserve to perish, but his mercy keeps us from us, and he gives us eternal life, which is grace. In studying John, I always liked the prologue to John's Gospel, and I want to read part of that, verses 14 through 17 of the first chapter of the Gospel of John. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory, the glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified about him and cried out, saying, this is he of whom I said, he who comes after me has a higher rank than I, for he existed before me. For of his fullness we have all received, and grace upon grace. There's that word again. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ. Amazing grace. Jesus was radical in bringing grace over law. You see, the culture into which he came was focused on the law. They were focused on the justice side of God, demanding that we keep every bit of the law. And Jesus argued with the Pharisees. We might say he fought with them, but really he was trying to teach them. Remember the story of the woman taken in adultery? Now, according to the law, she would have been stoned. I mean, literally pelted with stones until she died. But Jesus knelt down and wrote in the dust. And it said, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. Isn't it interesting we're still fighting the same battles? Salvation is by his grace. Our holiness, our sanctification is by his grace. In fact, our daily lives, our daily living is by grace. Faith and grace are teamed up. We have to believe, we have to accept. Not only just to accept as truth, but to live accordingly. If we believe in him, we'll follow his example and follow his word. We need to ask ourselves, what have I done since I have been saved or since I believed that makes me deserve heaven? And really, as a retired pastor, I look back across my years of service and I realize that nothing I've done has earned me eternal life. It's grace, his grace. My trusting in him for that grace is where I get eternal life. We need to distribute grace. Let's look at another passage from 1 Peter, chapter 4, verses 8 through 10. Peter says, above all, love each other deeply. That's grace. Because love covers a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each one of us should use whatever gift he's received to serve others, faithfully administering faithfully administering God's grace in its various forms. Peter tells us we have the responsibility to distribute that grace. Not only do we receive that amazing grace, but it's our responsibility to distribute it to others through love, hospitality, whatever gift we have to serve others. There's a story of the Russian spies. Judge Kaufman was their judge. The Rosenbergs were the spies. You've heard that name. In submission, at the end of that long, bitter trial, the lawyer for the Rosenberg summed it up and said, Your Honor, all my clients ask for is justice. And the judge says, the court has given you what you asked for, justice, after he had sentenced him. What you really want, he said, is mercy. But that's something that this court has no right to give. A court administers justice. In Philip Yancey's book, the title is, What's So Amazing About Grace? And in that book, Yancey says, the world can do anything as well or better than the church. That's kind of a profound statement. The world can do anything as well or better than the church. You don't have to be a Christian to build houses, feed the hungry, heal the sick. There's only one thing the church can do that the world can't do, and that's to offer grace. He put his finger on that thing, that very thing that Peter said. We are to faithfully administer God's grace. I have to ask myself, is that what the world is seeing in the church today? Are they seeing more judgment and condemnation and law than they are grace? You see, evangelism is the declaration of grace. Someone has said, I heard this many years ago, Evangelism is one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. Spreading the good news, evangelism. It's not preaching, it's not condemning, it's sharing the grace. Really, worship is a response to grace. It's giving God the glory and the credit and the praise and the thanksgiving for his grace. Love is the expression of grace. Forgiveness, compassion, friendship. Fellowship is the language of grace. Oh, folks, my wife and I have worked with a lot of seniors in different situations, in senior housing, nursing homes. And one of the things that's needed so much is fellowship, friends, loved ones. And so we as the church, we as individual Christians are charged, like Peter says, with the administration of this amazing grace. So grace is a commodity to be distributed, not to be kept to ourselves. So let me ask you a couple questions in closing. What would a measure of grace do for your marriage? What would a measure of grace do for your worst relationship? Someone has said, and I have mentioned this a number of times, your relationship with Jesus Christ can be no better than your relationship with the person you dislike the most. See, it takes grace. And then finally, what would a measure of grace do for our church? Oh, grace is amazing. Let's distribute grace. Let's model grace. His grace reflected in us. Thank you for being with us for this insights, biblical insights.